Spoilers for all of Game of Thrones and Watchmen follow. Game of Thrones has ended, and by the time this video reaches your subscription feed, so too will almost all of the interest in the final season. It received a lot of criticism, and I think most of it was well deserved, but ultimately it wasn't even bad enough that it could be memorable. It was just a dull, passionless end to a series that inspired so much excitement in the early seasons. This video won't be an extensive essay detailing all of the mistakes, the logical inconsistencies and poor writing that made up the final season. As much fun as it might be to tear apart how rushed Dany's final scenes were, how disappointing the confrontation with the Night King was, how disappointing it was for the writers to fridge Missandei, or how unbelievably stupid every single character was, this video won't be one of those. This will be an exploration of what I thought was the single largest mistake of the season, the scenes that followed it, and how those scenes made the same mistake countless films, shows, and books have also made after Watchmen, one of the most influential pieces of fiction from the past 100 years, showed us all how we can get it right. The final season of Game of Thrones is rife with weak characterization, unsatisfying conclusions, and baffling decisions. Where the series was previously a triumph of consistent world building and attention to detail, seasons 7 and 8 felt like a slap in the face to the logic and consistency that the show was once built on. Sure, there were issues before that, and I'll never forgive what they did to the Sand Snakes.
You want a good girl, but you need a bad pussy.
But season 7 and especially 8 marked the point where people started to be particularly vocal about their dissatisfaction. Season 7 certainly saw its fair share of frustrated fans, but perhaps no moment fell as flat as the one I think represents the single biggest mistake in the series. The moment when Dany turns from the heroic queen into the mad queen. A lot of shade has been thrown the way of the writers for this sequence, that it wasn't properly set up in the prior episodes, that fridging Missandei for the sake of Dany and Grey Worm's development was the laziest and most disappointing way for the story to get to this point, and that Dany ought to have headed straight to the Red Keep rather than randomly decide to murder civilians given the narrative setup that led to this point. I agree on all fronts, but I think the direction is also at fault here. Consider this, with a single scene I think Dany's turn, exactly as it was shown, could have been justified. Earlier in the season we saw Dany talk of her experiences in Westeros and how it has differed to everything else she experienced in the years prior, ending with the conclusion that if her people wouldn't love her, then she would make them fear her.
Alright then. Let it be fear.
Great, this is half of the setup she needed for this to make sense. The other half is the scene I think was missing, which I'll describe as such. In a scene that mirrors the shot from episode 10 of season 3, she dismounts, smiling, opening her arms to her people. Cut to said people recoiling in fear, one or two bowing stiffly. Cut to Dany's smile, faltering. Hold on Dany's face for a few beats before she sets her jaw and appears to come to a decision. Then play the rest of the scene as we saw in the episode. I think this motivation, an inability to deal with the fact King's Landing feared and despised her, where she'd always been previously welcomed with adoration, was the actual motivation the writers had in mind for this moment. But for the lack of a scene like the one I described, that motivation wasn't communicated properly, leaving many confused and many more angry. Without this scene, we assume Cersei is the actual target of her hatred, and that Dany doesn't act in accordance with that is baffling. The lack of this specific scene is not the mistake. I am obviously not an accomplished screenwriter, and it's easy to criticize a work with hindsight, especially one as complicated and involved as Game of Thrones. Despite the reactions Season 8 received, I very much doubt I, or anyone else on YouTube, could do better. But the lack of any scene here was the mistake. People felt confused and angry for good reason. Suddenly the show was asking us to make leaps of logic we hadn't been making up until this point. The careful character development was left behind for big events that weren't earned, and while it's not fair for me to be disappointed because I could do better, because I couldn't, it is disappointing that I feel like I could. In part 1, I established that I don't think the writers were the only ones to blame for this mistake, and the scenes that follow illustrate my issue with the director, or more specifically, how he was used. Miguel Sapochnik was the director for the episode in question, The Bells, as well as most of the episodes with big moments in the last few seasons, and it's obvious why. His work on the Battle of the Bastards ranks among the most thrilling battle scenes ever filmed. His direction made you feel claustrophobic, tense and relieved at all the right moments. And soon after, fans realised that when an episode was attached to Sapochnik's name, we could expect a bunch of larger scale conflicts or moments that entailed a lot of choreography. This was certainly true of the 2 episodes he directed in Season 8. The Long Night was as technically involved as it was narratively boring. So few named characters died, and they did so in such contrived, cliched and ridiculous ways that it felt a little flat, even for those that were actually able to see what was going on. But the scale was undeniably massive, the technical skill shown undeniably impressive, and that's how Sapochnik was used, as the guy to make big stuff happen. The Bells was similarly full of huge scenes, but again, Sapochnik was making the big things happen. This was a big episode where big things happened, but I cared about almost none of it. To explain why my eyes glazed over as Dany started raising King's Landing, I'd like to introduce a formula that estimates how much impact an event or character's death will have on me. It goes like this, with larger numbers representing a bigger impact. First, take the number of characters killed, or D. Now add a representation of how significant a character was prior to their death, represented by time on screen, or T, divided by the total number of characters in the piece as a whole, or C. Note: characters are only considered in the formula if they are named or have lines and appear in at least 2 scenes. Take that number and multiply it by the amount of possible time on screen in future, here represented by FT, and finally add the result to D. By my definition, only 4 characters die in Dany's sack of King's Landing. They are this woman and child, rather lazily introduced purely to be killed by Dany, and 2 major characters in Jaime and Cersei Lannister. The Hound and the Mountain don't count, they did each other in, nor do any of the other characters, or one of them, who died before King's Landing surrendered. The event here is Dany's genocide, not the battle that preceded it. So we have 4. Next, we add a representation of how important each character was. That's the T divided by D part. T represents how long a character has been around. So for this woman and child, that's 1 season. Let's make that 0.1 for each season. Cersei and Jaime have been around from the first season, so that would be 0.8 each, but given the show actually took 10 years total to make, let's make that an even 1 each. So that's 2.2. Then we divide that number by the total number of characters in the series. According to Wikipedia, because I'm all about rigorous research, Game of Thrones features 159 main or supporting roles. 2.2 divided by 159 equals a tad less than 0.0139. Taking the rounded total of 4 plus 0.0139 to 1 decimal point, leaves us back at the beginning with 4.0. There is a final element to the formula, but it doesn't affect either of the scenes I discussed from Game of Thrones or Watchmen, that being a multiplication of the final number by the total amount of potential future time on screen had they not been killed or affected by the event in question. Because in the case of Game of Thrones that's only one episode, and in the case of Watchmen only one chapter, I won't mention it again. So the pivotal scene in The Bells gets a final and very underwhelming score of 4. Now obviously this formula won't map directly to events and how much impact they actually had. Even if we were to measure time on screen by minutes and add additional complexity to how we measure the importance of each character, there's no way to accurately quantify the reactions you might have. But in each of its elements you can see what works for me. The value of the potential future screen time, or FT, is so important, even though it didn't affect this scene nor the one from Watchmen, because cutting a character's potential short will have a much larger impact than killing them right at the end of a season. Ned Stark's death is of course the perfect example, and no other death can have as much weight given how early he died and how important he was in the narrative. Meanwhile, the Hound, by his own admission mind you, has no potential left in his narrative by the time he dies, and as a result, although he was one of my favourite characters, I barely cared when he did die. These elements are balanced out a little by how much time we spend with a character. Even if they die in the final minutes of the final episode, if we've been following them for a long time, we will have some attachment to them that does affect the impact of the moment. For a lot of people, I think this element of the formula would be a lot more important, but hey, write your own formula. Finally, by dividing the amount of characters affected by the total size of the cast, you can estimate how big that particular impact was in the grand scheme of the media in question. 4 characters with a combined importance of 2.2 dying in the sack of King's Landing is terribly insignificant compared to, say, the amount that died during the Red Wedding. Far less people died overall, but the impact of the named characters and the amount of them that died was far greater, even without factoring in how many characters of that 159 total were added to the series after their deaths. My point then is this: the closer to the end of a series or piece of media you get, the more named or otherwise significant characters need to die or be affected in order to have the desired impact. In The Bells, the majority of the deaths felt inevitable. It was clear Cersei, the Hound, the Mountain and Qyburn wouldn't survive the series, and all but the Hound were set up to be characters we wouldn't particularly care about when they did die. So when Dany snaps and starts murdering civilians, it doesn't matter that the scale of what I'm seeing maps to the events taking place. The narrative impact just isn't there. Sapochnik's direction does nothing to drive that narrative home, and the script he's working with certainly doesn't help either. And to hear after the fact that Sapochnik wanted to kill more major characters off in The Long Night, but was advised against doing so in order to save those deaths for the Bells, sounds almost like a joke given how little impact the Bells ultimately had on me. Here, at last, we arrive at Watchmen, and specifically New York at 11:25 November 2nd. What felt missing in The Bells, and what is so often missing from other movies, books and TV, is a proper setup. It doesn't matter how many nameless civilians die in a scene, if it's not a character we know beforehand, I will barely notice. That's what felt like such a failure in The Bells. And worst of all, the creators knew full well audiences don't really care about unnamed characters.
In most large stories like this, it seems like there's a tendency to focus on the heroic figures and not pay much attention to the people who may be suffering from the repercussions of the decisions made by those heroic people. And we really wanted to keep our perspective and our our sympathies on the ground at this moment, because those are the people who are really paying the price for the decisions that she's making. Feels like you needed a perspective to carry you through this horror, like you need a Virgil to take you through the hell that Dany's building.
The reason we decided to follow Arya out of King's Landing and to see the fall of King's Landing through her eyes is something that we talked about with an earlier episode. You just care a lot more when you're with a character that you care about. So if we saw a lot of extras running around on fire and buildings falling apart, it might have been visually interesting, but it wouldn't have had much of an emotional impact. But when you're there on the ground with Arya, who's one of the people we care the most about, then everything takes on that much more of an edge.
They knew what they should have done, and they didn't do it. Remember how many people died in the Sept of Baelor? That had a lot of impact, because we knew so many of the characters that died. It meant something, and greatly changed the direction of the narrative. The sack of King's Landing should have felt the same. Plots and subplots, great houses and notable characters, all wiped out by a cruel, uncaring tyrant. Instead, we got some well-shot but distinctly soulless imagery. For those of you paying attention to the headings, you might be a little confused. This is the bit where I'm supposed to talk about Watchmen, right? Well, in a sense I am. Watchmen is one of those pieces of media that fundamentally changed my outlook after reading it. It had a profound effect on how I view media, how I discuss it, and most importantly, what I want from it. It's one of those rare works I consider to be as close to perfection as it is possible to be. And when we come to New York, we feel it. This is not the Bells. Without even looking at the named characters among the corpses, the imagery already has far more impact than the scenes Game of Thrones offered, which looked downright sanitized in comparison. But then you notice the characters lying among the corpses. Some that appeared in the very first pages, and others that served as the linchpin for whole chapters, lie under the rubble, almost indistinguishable from the rest of the nameless corpses that fill New York. Almost. We know who's under this newspaper because we've followed his story from the very first pages. We know who's under this man because we've followed his story from the 3rd chapter. We know why they're all gathered together, their individual motivations, and even why all of these unnamed characters were here before they all die. Watchmen offers a masterclass in building a world that feels real, and when something happens to that world, we feel it too. Watchmen doesn't just tell you to care, it makes you care. 2 women whose relationship to each other is falling apart, a man trying to learn to live without his partner, 2 detectives stumbling around the edges of a grand conspiracy, a kid reading a comic book. They mattered. In a fictional world filled with the superhuman, they were human. Just human, but no less important than all of the superheroes we follow, and indeed far closer to these supposed superheroes than the civilians of King's Landing were to its lords and ladies. They had lives, desires, interests, and frustrations, and in my eyes they remain the gold standard for character and world building outside of the main cast. Each individual character has far more weight for me than the total death count in the Bells, but even putting that aside, let's look at the numbers again, but Watchmen's this time. Here I'm going to count every recognizable corpse I can pick out from these pages. While I think this gang, and this knot top in particular, could be among the dead, I can't be sure, so they don't count. First, we have this street salesman, still grasping one of his watches, first introduced in chapter 6. Next, we have the 2 detectives, first seen in the very first chapter, and behind them, the cab driver, first seen in chapter 3, and her girlfriend, introduced in chapter 11. Next to them is the psychiatrist that saw Rorschach in prison and his wife, both from chapter 6, with the cab driver's employer and co-worker introduced in chapter 11 just behind them. Finally, we have the 2 Bernards, introduced in chapter 3, who only learnt each other's names minutes before they died. That's a total of 11 named characters that died. Without even looking at how important each was to the narrative, Watchmen already comes ahead of Game of Thrones. Next, we add their importance as represented by their time, with 0.1 per chapter. That's 0.5 for the salesman, 2.2 for both detectives, but let's again be generous to Game of Thrones and give them a neat 1 each, so that's 2 for the both of them. The cab driver is 0.9 and her girlfriend is 0.1. The psychiatrist and his wife come in at 0.6 each for a combined 1.2, and the cab driver's employer and co-worker come in at 0.1 each for 0.2 together. Finally, we have the two Bernards, and their combined number comes to 1.8, although that falls far short of their actual importance to the narrative. The total we add then comes to 6.7. Now we divide that number by the total number of characters in the graphic novel. There's no Wikipedia list to go off here, so forgive me if I mistakenly missed or added someone as I went through the entirety of Watchmen just for this one silly sentence. There are, by my admittedly somewhat arbitrary rules, 39 characters in Watchmen. 6.7 divided by 39 gives us a touch over 0.17. Rounded to the nearest decimal point, that's 0.2. Our final number for Watchmen then is 11.2, easily doubling the Bell's rather pathetic 4. But by now you probably have an idea of what my point is, and it's not going to be found in this arbitrary formula I just made up. The gold standard these characters represent is part of the reason why I felt so frustrated with the Bells, as well as countless other shows and movies that similarly failed to invest me in the events on screen. But there was more to it. Here I want to return to this clip. Weiss and Benioff offered their takes on the various decisions they made in the final season in interview segments tacked onto the end of each episode. While these segments may have been interesting in a Season 8 that lived up to the expectations the early seasons left us with, when attached to the season we got, they felt like preemptive damage control, like an attempt to guide the conversation before it began. It felt rather pathetic, and a lot of the ire Season 8 garnered arose from these segments. In truth, I just felt left down as the credits rolled on the Bells, until said segment began, and the writers said this.
The reason we decided to follow Arya out of King's Landing and to see the fall of King's Landing through her eyes is something that we talked about with an earlier episode. You just care a lot more when you're with a character that you care about. So if we saw a lot of extras running around on fire and buildings falling apart, it might have been visually interesting, but it wouldn't have had much of an emotional impact. But when you're there on the ground with Arya, who's one of the people we care the most about, then everything takes on that much more of an edge.
Was that a joke? All we did see were extras on fire, and because there was a bad and highly infectious case of plot armor going around since Season 7, I doubt anyone actually thought Arya was in any danger. After hearing that was when I first started to think about making this video. They knew. They, talented professionals with all the money, resources and even time they could ever want, knew what they had to do, and they did the bare minimum. Where Watchmen built New York City brick by brick, person by person before destroying it, Weiss and Benioff decided Arya as tour guide and a woman and child introduced purely and exclusively to die in this scene was enough. They just didn't care to build King's Landing before destroying it. We never would have needed Arya at all if the showrunners only had the barest amount of foresight. All of the council, the lords and ladies, knights and peasants that might have made up the fabric of King's Landing had already been killed or forgotten. But even then, more should have been done. Wouldn't a brief reunion with Hot Pie before he became Burnt Pie been a far more emotional scene and a far better use of Arya as a guide than what we eventually saw? Wouldn't a desperate Tyrion trying to salvage some peace from a situation already too far gone have made for a better death to sell the impact of Dany's decision? Wouldn't the tiniest bit of character development in King's Landing's ordinary people have been a far better use of time than this absolute mess of painful dialogue in Season 8's second episode?
That's how I got so strong. Giant's milk. Maybe I will have that drink.
What really made me angry, though, was not that they didn't consider these possibilities, nor that they didn't plan for what was coming, but that they ultimately didn't care. Returning to these interview clips, it's so obvious they just weren't into it anymore, and that's understandable. 10 years living and breathing this universe would probably leave me feeling pretty detached too. But if they weren't interested in putting in the effort, they should have handed the reins to someone who was. These clips ultimately did explain the creative decisions they made, but did so in the delivery, not in the content of their answers. It became glaringly obvious why they fridged Missandei, why they didn't take the offer of a full season, or had Tyrion, a prisoner, ultimately decide the way the whole of Westeros would be ruled, while the lords and ladies just nod. It was the easiest, quickest option. It didn't matter that it didn't make sense. It didn't matter that it didn't fit thematically or tonally with the series. It was the simplest, most direct route to the ending they had decided upon. And here we come to a strange comparison. A comparison between Adrian Veidt, the man who murdered half of New York City in Watchmen, and Weiss and Benioff, who were running the show and wrote the vast majority of Game of Thrones. This is where I start to reach. Everything else in this video is at least on some level immediately observable, but here things will get a little weird. Veidt was a character focused on a single idea. He was obsessed with Alexander the Great, his unravelling of the Gordian knot by slicing it with his sword, and his goal of uniting the world under his rule. He saw himself as a reincarnation of, or successor to, that man. A man who wouldn't attempt to unravel the Gordian knot with his hands, but thought to use a different approach to reach the same end. He believed he was ultimately justified in killing half a city because it would bring peace. With peace achieved, what would it matter what it cost? Peace and a unified world, or totally mutually assured destruction, were the only endings he could envision to the Cold War. So he justified away the death of millions because, in his mind, the alternative was the death of billions. All of the other superheroes are on a path to stop him, knowingly or not, but by the time they realize Veidt is behind whatever is going on, he already gave his supervillain monologue, and it was given in the past tense. He did it 35 minutes ago. 35 minutes ago, he was the world's biggest threat, but now he is the dark savior of a world on the brink of disaster. Someone who committed unspeakable evil to save the lives of billions. Or at least that's how everyone sees him except for Rorschach. Rorschach is deeply, deeply disturbed. His opening lines via his journal describe the citizens of New York as not worth saving. The liberal elite that Veidt is a part of are scum, the cause for all of the world's problems and the solution to none of them. At the same time, he has dedicated his life to fighting the criminal element in his neighborhood, albeit seemingly because it's the only way he can feel powerful or even alive, rather than out of a desire to actually protect people. Then, confronted with someone that actually did kill all of the people he seemingly despised, he finds he actually cared. They still mattered to him, as broken as he was, and even if it meant the literal end of the world, the evil Veidt represented deserved to be revealed and punished, just as any other would under his rigid black and white moral code. Viet's solution demanded moral compromise, and the only one who couldn't make that compromise was himself, the most compromised of the remaining Watchmen. Rorschach makes his choice, and Viet reveals just how removed from reality he is, making a bad pun and going off to meditate. It's this moment that reminds me of Weiss and Benioff. Their interview clips have become fodder for ridicule all over the internet, specifically for how out of touch they seem to be with what people wanted. They act as though surprising their audience was their actual goal.
For, I think it's probably 3 years now or something, we've known that it was going to be Arya who delivers that fatal blow.
She seemed like the best candidate, provided we weren't thinking about her in that moment.
As though all of the narratives set up for major moments in the series were a bad thing if someone picked up on them. As though media literacy and an understanding of foreshadowing made the audience an enemy to combat. When they decided to tack on these interview excerpts expressing this perspective to each episode, they came across as aloof, proud of what decisions they had made, and seemingly entirely disconnected from the actual show that resulted from these decisions. They did it. Viet's tears of joy for having achieved his life's goal contrast with every other character's horror with how he achieved that goal. Similarly, when Weiss and Benioff tell us how Danny snapped and why, they seem totally out of touch with the way people reacted. We didn't want to be told afterwards why she snapped. We wanted to be shown why. There was nothing wrong with Emilia Clarke's performance in this scene. Indeed, I think she did pretty well with what she was given, but no actor can convey what needed to be conveyed in this shot alone. And for Benioff and Weiss to mistake foreshadowing for character development in the lead up to this pivotal scene leaves me wondering if they were able to look at their own work with any kind of perspective at all. It feels as though they were so trapped in their own work they totally missed what made that work so exciting for everyone else in the first place. They started out as heroes plotting out a complicated narrative on a grand scale with a set goal in mind, and after they reached that goal, they finish as villains that thought whatever shortcuts they took along the way were worth it if the end was the same. I wanted Danny to snap. It was always on the cards. It was obvious that was where her story was headed, but it was a moment that needed proper setup. This wasn't it, and neither was this. Conclusions are hard. I just wrote some 5,000 words in a messy and ill-advised comparison between two very different pieces of fiction, and somehow I have to wrap it all up now. Conclusions are much harder with fictional universes though. I can comfortably sit behind my keyboard and talk about how obvious the lessons Watchmen taught are, and exactly how to apply them to any piece of media. But any criticisms I make are always going to be a combination of a guessing game and ignorance on my part. I don't know why these interview segments were attached to the end of each episode. I don't know what exactly drove the decisions that were made in Game of Thrones' final season. There's an excellent video essay put together by the director of Shazam, discussing how everything in filmmaking is a process of problem solving, which I highly recommend you watch. It paints a picture of what being at the helm of a massive creative project is like, and also why videos like the one I just made are often very far off the mark. We just don't know what went into a decision, and that's partially why I feel uncomfortable putting names to decisions in videos like this. I love Watchmen, but how many of the ideas and elements I love can be attributed to Alan Moore, and how many to Dave Gibbons, and how many on top of that to my own interpretation, an interpretation that may not even ring true to the actual intention of the authors. So I try to praise a work rather than the creator, and for that reason I feel uncomfortable attaching my criticisms of Game of Thrones to names. So please bear in mind both my biased interpretations and ignorance of the massive effort that went into the work I criticized in this video. I must stress I don't think I could do any better, but I want to see better, and I know those involved in Season 8 are capable of better. So, to finally sum up, here's what Game of Thrones should have learned from Watchmen. First, spend a while setting up your characters and the events they are involved in. This was a letdown that really didn't need to be one, with just one additional scene or line and a touch more development. Second, big events don't have a big impact just by virtue of their size. King's Landing meant nothing to me, and that didn't have to be the case. If you want to sell me on a big emotional moment, first invest me emotionally. Spend some time building characters and motivations before discarding them, and I'll feel it a lot more than I will just watching strangers die. Third, care about what you make, or pass it on to someone who will. It's damn hard to make as much TV at the quality Weiss and Benioff did, but it really started to tail rapidly when they weren't any longer adapting a series they loved, and were instead finishing a show they had begun. And finally, fourth, the closer you are to the end of a piece of fiction, the harder it will be to impart the impact you want to. The later seasons of Game of Thrones felt toothless, empty, and dull. Killing off a main character will have a much bigger impact early in the narrative than it will later on, and if you want a big impact, you'd better do more than just introduce a mother and child purely to murder them. With all that said, and without letting the final season off the hook for some terrible decisions, I don't want this to be the last attempt at telling a story with such an ambitious scope. I think Game of Thrones ultimately couldn't live up to its promise, but I don't think it's necessarily true that would happen to any show of this size. Regardless of my thoughts on the later episodes of Game of Thrones, I have to applaud the effort that went into making the show as a whole. If I come across as a little scathing, I hope it's obvious that's because of the immense promise I saw in the first few seasons. So, until HBO butchers Watchmen in the upcoming TV series, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is it fair to compare Watchmen to Game of Thrones? Was my comparison between Viet and the show's head writers a massive stretch? As always, let me know in the comments below. Cheers. Have a good one.